The day Aurora inherited everything, her parents came back. Not the next week. Not years earlier when she was lonely, scared, and desperate for answers. They returned the moment there was a mansion, a business, and a fortune on the table. At first, they cried and said they wanted to make things right, but Aurora noticed the questions they asked, the debts they mentioned, and the way their eyes moved around the house. Something was wrong. Then a mysterious woman called with a warning. Don't agree to anything until you know the truth. What Aurora found that night changed her idea of family forever.
My name is Chloe. I am 27, and my life just imploded. Yesterday, I inherited an empire. My grandfather Marcus Thorne left me everything: his entire hotel dynasty, his historic Boston brownstone, and a fortune I can't even comprehend. I was still reeling from the grief when they showed up. My parents, the two people who vanished 10 years ago. They smiled like no time had passed. "We here for you, sweetie," my mother cooed. Then my lawyer entered. The second they saw him, their faces fell, and they looked like they'd just seen a ghost. To understand how insane this is, you need to come back with me. Back to when I was 16, and everything fell apart. Back then, my mother was my entire universe. My dad passed away when I was young, so it was always just us. She was a brilliant singer-songwriter, and while we were always broke, our life felt rich. Our tiny apartment was filled with music and creativity. But I was a teenager, completely blind to the red flags, the hushed arguments about overdue bills, the producers she was always meeting for late-night drinks, the expensive new guitar for her producer boyfriend Rex, while our own fridge was nearly empty. My mom lived for her music, but Rex dragged her into the dark, cutthroat side of the industry. I remember hearing her on the phone with our landlord, begging for an extension on the rent. Rex would just brush it off, swearing a huge record deal was just around the corner. His promises were always empty. And my mom, she started to break. Her passion for music became an obsession. She started skipping my soccer games for his studio sessions. Our home grew quiet and tense. If I asked about money, she'd insist we were fine, but then she'd look at me with this haunted expression, but like she was trying to burn my face into her memory. So I tried to become invisible. I got straight A's, won school awards, and never asked for anything. I kept our apartment immaculate. I figured if I was easy, if I wasn't another source of stress, she'd come back to me and things would be okay again. The day they left is seared into my brain. It was a Wednesday. They were supposedly off to Nashville for a 2-week recording trip. My mom hugged me so tightly, she shook, swearing she'd call every single night. But their suitcases were bulging. Her closet was already half empty. And then I found the note on the kitchen table. "Chloe, we're not coming back. Your grandfather Marcus will be in touch. It's for the best." That was all. 16 years of being her daughter, gone in 20 words. I called her cell again and again, but the number was already out of service. I checked Rex's social media and found a photo of them laughing on a beach in Miami. I'd only met my grandfather Marcus a few times. He was my dad's father, a hotel tycoon who lived in Boston. He was sharp, formidable, and according to my mom, he despised their bohemian lifestyle. I didn't have his number or any way to reach him. I had no idea if he even knew they'd left. I was completely, terrifyingly alone. My thoughts were spinning. Was I going to end up in foster care? What if they changed their minds and I wasn't there when they came back? I ate crackers for dinner and fell asleep on the sofa, clutching my phone. The next morning, a call came from a Boston area code. It was my grandfather's executive assistant. My mother had sent him a single, curt email. The assistant, a woman named Mrs. Gable, had a calm, steady voice that cut right through my panic. She told me a flight and a car were arranged, that Mr. Thorne was handling it. I heard her speaking to him in the background. "Marcus, she's been abandoned." A long silence. "Otherwise, the state will have to intervene." I heard her say, "I understand this is unexpected, but she has nobody." Then his voice came through, crisp and decisive. "I'm on my way. She is not to spend another night in that house alone." My grandfather Marcus arrived that evening in a sleek black car that looked like a spaceship on our rundown street. He wore an impeccably tailored suit, every silver hair in place. He looked at me, and his expression wasn't one of pity or anger. It was resolute. "Pack a bag," he said, his voice firm. "Bring what you need for the next few days." His driver managed everything while I robotically threw things into a suitcase. I just packed clothes, my laptop, a couple photo albums, and my guitar. I walked out of that apartment and never looked back, leaving my entire childhood behind. The drive to Boston felt endless. He never once asked if I was okay. Instead, he discussed hotel occupancy rates and market trends as we drove. The legal process was a blur. His army of lawyers handled everything. My mother and Rex never even appeared. They just signed away their parental rights from a resort somewhere in Florida. The state made a formal attempt to contact them, but they had simply disappeared into the ether. Just gone. An abandonment like that leaves a deep scar, one that therapy can expose but never truly heal. For years, I had nightmares. I'd wake up convinced I heard the front door, hoping they'd return to say it was all a terrible mistake. I have a digital folder of unsent, rage-filled emails. I'd see a woman with my mom's fiery red hair and forget how to breathe for a second. My therapist helped me see it wasn't my fault. Their actions were a reflection of them, not me. Adults often act from their own unresolved pain, she explained. A child blames themselves because it creates an illusion of control. If it's your fault, you can fix it. But Chloe, this was never your mess to clean up. My brain accepted it long before my heart did, but I eventually stopped looking for them. In college, I finally stopped stalking their online profiles. At 22, I deleted their numbers. At 25, I finally made peace with the fact they were never, ever coming back. And through it all, Marcus was my constant. He wasn't affectionate, but he was always there. He was a man of his word. He showed up for every school event and gave me everything I could possibly need. It wasn't the warm, cuddly love I'd known, but it was solid as a rock. Moving into Marcus's home was like entering a different dimension. His Beacon Hill brownstone was a world of polished mahogany and quiet elegance. My new bedroom was bigger than our old apartment, with a fireplace and a view of a private garden. But with this new life came rules. A lot of unspoken rules. Breakfast was at 7 a.m. sharp. Academics were non-negotiable, and clutter was simply not tolerated. He expected an hour of guitar practice every single day, whether I felt like it or not. Homework was done at my desk, not on the priceless antique furniture. Dinner conversations were about economics, politics, and the hospitality business. No television on weekdays. I think I managed to break every one of those rules within the first month. I was pushing him, testing his limits, secretly waiting for him to get tired of me too. But Marcus never yelled. Instead, every choice had a direct and logical consequence. If I skipped breakfast, I stayed hungry. If my homework was late, my weekend was canceled until it was done. But every so often, I'd see a little crack in that formidable exterior. One time, he found me crying over an old photograph of my dad. He just placed a box of tissues on my desk and quietly left the room. When I nearly failed my economics class, he didn't raise his voice. He simply hired the best tutor in all of Boston. Marcus had built his hotel empire from a single failing motel. He was always working, but he made it home for dinner every night, often with a stack of blueprints for a new property. My real education took place on weekends, when I did sit in on his business meetings. His sister, my Aunt Beatrice, would coach me. Watch their posture, Chloe. Who makes eye contact? Who's really in charge here? She always said that business was just applied psychology. So when my public high school stopped being a challenge, they enrolled me in an elite private academy with a staggering tuition and even more staggering academic standards. It was a massive culture shock. I was academically behind, and the other kids were from a different universe of old money. I basically lived in the library, just trying to survive. There were nights I was certain I was going to fail, that I would never belong in his world. But Aunt Beatrice didn't have time for quitting. I remember sobbing over a physics book one night when she told me, "What happened to you is out of your control. But what you do now, that is 100% up to you. You can rise to this challenge or you can let it break you. We don't invest in projects that break." It was brutal, but it was the motivation I desperately needed. I took my allowance, hired an older student to tutor me, and started a study group. By my junior year, I had fought my way onto the honor roll. Then college applications started a completely different kind of pressure. I wanted to stay in Boston, go to a local university with my friends. But my grandfather, Marcus, would only discuss the Ivy League. "Your friends are thinking about the next 4 years," he'd lecture. "You need to be thinking about the rest of your life." That was the biggest fight we ever had. I screamed that he was controlling every part of my life. He retorted that I was squandering my potential because I was scared. "I never asked to be your legacy," I yelled. "And I never asked to be your guardian," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "But here we are. I'm giving you the future your parents threw away." His words cut right through me, and in that silence, he did the unthinkable. He told me about my father. "Your dad was brilliant," he said, his voice flat, "a natural architect. But he had zero discipline, no ambition. He wanted the prize without the fight." He explained how my father chased one pyramid scheme after another, while my mother just let him. "They were smart, but they were weak. I will not let you inherit that weakness." It was the first time he'd ever spoken of them without fire in his eyes. I finally understood his crushing expectations, and everything just clicked. I applied to 7 architecture schools, got into 5, and chose a top design program. My grandfather paid for it all without a word, and I knew what that sacrifice cost him. College felt like coming up for air. I joined clubs, made friends, and found a talent for design that paired perfectly with the business sense he drilled into me. I spent my summers interning at his firm, learning everything from drafting blueprints to winning over clients. Our entire relationship changed during those years. The space between us actually brought us closer. Our Sunday calls turned into real conversations, full of actual laughter. When I graduated with honors, the pride in his eyes was undeniable, even though all he gave me was a firm handshake. I moved back home and became his junior partner. We found our rhythm, a perfect partnership at work and at home. I tried dating, but my grandfather saw every man's as a threat to my future. Then, 2 years ago, our whole world cracked. He was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. The outlook was bleak, but he fought it like a hostile takeover. When I fell apart, he just said, "Everyone has a deadline. What matters is what you build before the clock runs out." He worked as long as he could, handing more and more responsibility to me. Our roles slowly flipped. I was now managing his pills, his appointments, his life. In his last months, a softness I had never known appeared in him. One evening, helping him to bed, he gripped my hand. "You were the child as I always wished I had," he whispered. "Bringing you here was the best decision I ever made." He passed away in his sleep 8 months later. The funeral was small, mostly colleagues from the firm. Standing at his grave, it hit me that I had just lost the only real parent I ever knew. The grief was a physical thing. The house was suddenly a hollow, silent space. I kept expecting to hear his footsteps or finding articles on design I wanted to show him. I threw myself into the business, running it just like he would have. It was my way of honoring his legacy. I was sure I would never see my biological parents again until the will was read. 3 weeks after the funeral, a letter came from Mr. Davies, his lawyer of 30 years. The reading was Tuesday at 10 a.m. for all interested parties. I assumed that just meant me and a few charities. Davies was old school, with white hair and glasses he always peered over. His office was a time warp of leather and antique books, with a huge desk that had probably altered hundreds of lives. I arrived 15 minutes early in a navy suit my grandfather would have liked. Davies offered his condolences and said we were waiting for others. I tried reading a magazine in a leather armchair, but the words were a blur. Then the door swung open. I looked up, expecting one of the firm's senior partners. In that instant, my entire world came to a stop. Standing in the doorway were the two people I never thought I would see again. My parents. Time had been cruel to my father. His hair was thin and gray, his face a map of broken promises, and his shoulders slumped with an invisible weight. He'd gained at least 50 pounds, turning his former athletic frame into pure softness. My mother looked even worse. Her hair was a harsh, cheap cut, and her face was thin and gaunt. Dark circles were tattooed under her eyes, and her smile was an empty performance. She was clutching an old purse so tight, her knuckles were white. "Chloe," my father said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "Just look at you." They walked toward me as I stood on legs that felt like they would buckle. My mother moved in for a hug, but I was frozen. I stood there, stiff as a board, as her thin arms wrapped around me. Her perfume was a ghost from another lifetime. "We tried to find you," she lied, like pulling back to inspect me. "You look just like your grandfather. So successful." My own voice sounded strange when I asked, "How did you know to be here?" My father gave a weak, sad smile. "We saw the obituary. We've been keeping an eye on things. We always knew you were with Mark." Of course they knew. They knew where I was for 15 years and never once bothered to call. The room felt like it was tilting. "Please, have a seat," Mr. Davies interrupted, gesturing to the chairs. "We're just waiting for one more person." Just then, a woman came in. It was Mark's executive assistant. She had always been kind. She gave me a look of pure sympathy before sitting by the window, keeping her distance from my parents. While we waited, they tried to make strange small talk. "We're living in Arizona now," my mother said. "The dry heat is good for your father's joints." My father added he was running a small hardware store. "It isn't much," he mumbled, "but it pays the bills." I just nodded, my mind racing. I was a messy collision of grief, fury, and a tiny, pathetic spark of hope. Mr. Davies cleared his throat and opened a thick folder. "We are gathered today for the last will and testament of Mark Vance," he began. "I will summarize the key points before we distribute the full documents." My parents both leaned forward, a tiny movement that screamed why they were really here. They hadn't come for me at all. They'd come for his money. Mr. Davies peered over his glasses. "To my granddaughter, Chloe Evans, I leave my entire estate. This includes the residence at 18 Beacon Hill Place, with all its contents. My controlling interest in Vance Design Group, valued at approximately $15 million. All financial accounts, investment portfolios, and related trusts, totaling nearly $3 million in cash. And finally, all personal effects, including his art collection, vehicles, and the body of his life's work. The room was dead silent. I knew he was successful, but I had no idea. The numbers sucked the air from my lungs. My grandfather was a giant in his field, but I never knew the true scale of his empire. My father cleared his throat. "Excuse me, Mr. Davies, is that everything?" The lawyer just stared at him. "There are minor bequests for loyal employees," he said, nodding to Mark's assistant, "and funds for the family's trust. But yes, the core of the estate goes to Chloe." My mother's smile was glued on. "Well, that is a massive responsibility for a young woman, especially in her condition," she cooed, patting my arm. Her touch felt like a brand. "It's a good thing we're here now to help her manage it all." Mr. Davies just slowly lifted one eyebrow, and his silence was more powerful than any shouting match. My father jumped in, trying to sound logical. "Legally, with Chloe being in a delicate situation and our parental rights never being terminated, we have a clear interest in her welfare." A cold dread washed over me. After 15 years, they were here to take over my life and my baby's life. I opened my mouth to object, but Mr. Davies spoke first. "I believe," he said calmly, "that there is a misunderstanding of the legal facts here. Perhaps we should continue this tomorrow after I've prepared the relevant paperwork. Shall we say 2 p.m.?" My parents exchanged a look before my father agreed. "That time works for us. We're at the Fairmont. We could have lunch first, Chloe, and properly catch up." Before I could even think, Mr. Davies was on his feet. "If you'll excuse us, I have urgent and private matters to review with my client." My parents looked like they might argue, but they stood up. "We'll see you tomorrow, dear," my mother said, forcing another hug on me. "We have so much to talk about." As they left, my father pushed a business card into my hand. The conference room door clicked shut, and I collapsed into the leather chair, my hands trembling. "Do they have a real claim, Mr. Davies?" I whispered. His expression was grim. "You need to prepare for a fight, Chloe," he sighed. "Your grandfather saw this coming, but I need to access the special provisions he made." Mark's assistant, Maria, squeezed my shoulder before she left. "Your grandfather was a brilliant man," she said softly. "Trust that he would never leave you and this baby unprotected." I walked out of that office in a total fog. The stable life my grandfather had built for me was now under attack. But anger wasn't there, just a deep, hollow emptiness. Against my lawyer's warning, I told her yes, I'd meet her for a drink. Some broken part of me needed to hear the lies from her own mouth. I chose a place we'd never been, a sterile lobby bar downtown. She was waiting in a booth, poised and perfect, rising to greet me with a practiced smile. She'd already ordered a drink for herself. "Liam's favorite," she said, nodding at the empty chair beside her. "I thought you might want the same." "I'm pregnant. I'm not drinking," I told her, asking the waiter for a seltzer. It was a tiny victory, but it felt important to show I wasn't some helpless victim she could steamroll. The silence that followed was heavy and awkward. She asked about the baby, my health, the service. I gave her short, clipped answers, searching her face for any hint of guilt. "We owe you the truth, Ava," she finally said, her perfectly manicured hand sliding across the table. I left mine on my glass. What Liam and I had it was a real relationship. He was so unhappy in his marriage, so lost. "We were building a future," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "We were happy." Her expression shifted to one that looked sickeningly like pity. "He had his public life with you. He had his real life with me. You were his dirty little secret." I shot back, my voice low and tight. "I was his escape plan," she insisted. "He was in therapy. We went together. He was finally getting honest about what he really wanted. We talked about telling you," she added, her eyes welling up. "But he was so scared. Scared to hurt you, especially once he found out about the baby. We saw each other at least 3 times a week. He told me about the nursery plans, about the names you were fighting over. He told me everything." The thought of him discussing our child with her made my blood run cold. He had made her a silent, secret partner in my pregnancy, in my life. I regret every single day I didn't get with him. She pushed on, a single perfect tear rolling down her cheek. "Seeing your photos from the funeral, it kills me that I couldn't be there to say goodbye." The waiter brought my seltzer, giving us a momentary break. When he left, her entire demeanor changed. "Liam did very well for himself," she said, swirling the ice in her drink. "He built a real empire. This apartment alone must be worth $10 million, she added nonchalantly, "and the company that's so much for a new mother to handle all on her own." "I was his COO for 5 years," I replied, my voice like steel. "I know the company inside and out." I watched her as the mask fell away, the performance shifting from fake grief to a cold, hard shakedown. The game was finally becoming clear. "I could help you, you know," she offered. I made a few mistakes, but Liam taught me so much about his vision for the future. That's a bold claim from the woman who was siphoning money from his private accounts for 2 years. I saw her jaw tighten, but she recovered in a heartbeat. Those were investments he wanted me to make. I know his plans. She leaned forward. I have nothing now. He paid for my condo, my car, it's all gone. What is it you want, Sophia? I asked, cutting her off. My direct question seemed to throw her. It was one more sign Liam had painted me as a fragile little wife she could easily control. I don't want anything, she lied, her voice suddenly weak. I just want what I'm owed, what he promised me. A private settlement would be better for the baby. To avoid a messy public fight, she continued, 500,000 would cover my immediate expenses, she said in a rush, and another 2 million would secure my future, like he intended. I leaned back, feeling a cold rage build inside me. So, $2.5 million, I said. And what's the price for my damages? The lies, the betrayal, and a son who will grow up without his father. So what's the going rate for that? I asked. My mother-in-law's crocodile tears immediately started to flow. Ava, honey, money can't fix this. We just want to be here for you, to be family. A family that costs $2 million to join, I shot back. My father-in-law's face hardened. It's not like that. We made mistakes, yes. But we gave Liam the seed money for his first startup, not you. And that means you're entitled to a piece of his estate, I asked. Not entitled, he corrected. Just included. We are his parents, Ava. That has to count for something. I thought about my husband, Liam. His loyalty, not his bloodline, was what defined him. You're right, I said softly. Family matters. But what you do for that family matters more. The rest of the dinner was a pathetic display of emotional manipulation and financial desperation. By dessert, they'd brought up their own debts and even suggested I hire them at the company for a massive salary. As we left, his mother hugged me, whispering, "Just think about what family means. We've all made mistakes." I drove away from their house feeling absolutely nothing. Some parts of their story were true. I remembered Liam complaining about their endless borrowing, about his father's failed businesses, but this felt different, too polished. Their sudden interest was all about the money. When I got home, a single message was on the answering machine from a blocked number. Mrs. Hayes? My name is Brenda Shaw. I was your husband's first executive assistant. I saw the obituary and, well, I think you should call me. Before you give his parents a single dime. There are things you need to know. I didn't sleep a wink that night. I just sat there, looking up corporate laws until my eyes were raw. My late-night digging confirmed my suspicions. They didn't have a legal leg to stand on. So why was my lawyer, Mr. Peterson, so worried? What was he anticipating? At 3 in the morning, I was in Liam's home office, desperate for some kind of answer. I ran my hand along his old oak desk and felt it a slight give in the wood. A hidden drawer slid open. Inside was a single file labeled with his parents' names. It detailed a history of betrayal I never imagined. The next day, I walked into Mr. Peterson's office with the file. His parents were already there with a sharp-looking man. "This is our attorney," his father said with a strained smile. "Just a precaution. These legal things can get so complicated," Liam's father added with a nervous chuckle. Mr. Peterson gave them a polite nod, but his expression was pure granite. His assistant, Helen, brought in a cart loaded with files and set up a projector. The room felt heavy. This wasn't a family meeting. It was an ambush. "Before we start," Mr. Peterson said calmly, "let's be perfectly clear. I am the executor of Liam Hayes' estate. I was his lawyer for 15 years, and I am also representing his wife, Ava, at Liam's specific instruction." Their lawyer leaned in. "My clients are obviously concerned. This is a massive company for their grieving daughter-in-law to manage alone. They simply want to provide some oversight." Mr. Peterson just nodded slowly. "Their history of oversight is exactly what I'd like to discuss," Mr. Peterson said. "It seems there's a serious misunderstanding about your legal rights here." He opened the first thick binder on the cart. "Let's stick to the documented facts, shall we?" He produced several notarized documents. "When Liam founded his second company, you were both put on the board. Company records show that within 1 year, you two had embezzled over $100,000. His mother looked shocked. "It was a misunderstanding with accounting." "Was it?" Mr. Peterson countered. "Because after that, Liam was forced to file a legal injunction to keep you from ever accessing company funds again. Notices went to your last known as addresses and were published in city records." My father started to squirm in his chair. "We never got anything." "That's strange," Mr. Davies said, "because the court was contacted by someone acting on your behalf." He pulled out another document. A man named Frank Miller came forward with a signed waiver, supposedly from you both, giving permanent guardianship to Eleanor Dubois. My parents exchanged a look that said it all before my father finally spoke. We never authorized anyone to do that for us. Those signatures must be forgeries. Mr. Davies adjusted his glasses. Mrs. Dubois was worried that might be the case at the time. She hired a private investigator to find you and learn your official stance. He opened another file, this one full of reports and photographs. The investigator found Mr. Hayes playing at several casinos in Reno during that time. He also photographed Mrs. Hayes working as a waitress in those exact same places. When asked about Clara's welfare, you both clearly said you wanted to give up all your parental rights. The color drained completely from my mother's face. My father's jaw was clenched tight. And there's more, Mr. Davies continued without an ounce of mercy. The investigator recorded a $20,000 payment from Frank Miller to Mr. Hayes the day after that waiver was signed. That was for a separate business deal, my father protested. But his voice was weak. Mr. Davies didn't even look at him. Mrs. Dubois paid for an annual investigation to check on your circumstances, to see if a reunion was ever in Clara's best interest. I have 15 years of reports here detailing chronic gambling, a series of evictions, unstable employment, and multiple run-ins with debt collectors. He turns to another tab in the binder. Of particular interest are these recorded attempts by Mrs. Hayes to contact Clara when she came of age. He slid a single page across the desk toward me. 3 calls to Eleanor S. home where Mrs. Hayes simply hung up, and an email sent to Clara S. University account, which bounced because the address was spelled incorrectly. I stared at the evidence of these pathetic attempts, feeling a strange mix of anger and vindication. But most importantly, Mr. Sterling said, sliding a tablet across the desk, Isabella left this message for this specific occasion. He tapped the screen. The file was labeled simply for Maya in her stylish script. You may want to listen to this alone, Mr. Sterling offered. I shook my head and pressed play. My aunt's voice filled the room, calm and clear. My dearest Maya, she began, if you are hearing this, then I am gone, and your parents have conveniently reappeared. This is no accident. For years, I've kept a meticulous log of every attempt they made to get my money, using you as leverage. My mother, Camila, let out a small gasp, but Isabella's voice continued, unwavering. 6 months after you came to live with me, Julian called. He wanted $100,000 to sign over guardianship permanently. I paid it. A public court fight would have destroyed you. A few years after that, he tried again, spinning some tale about a ruined play and debts to loan sharks. I said no and hired private security for the house. I glanced over. My father was studying a loose thread on his cuff. Then, on your 16th birthday, your mother called me, claiming she had a rare disease and needed cash for a clinic in Europe. My private investigator found she was perfectly healthy. When you were accepted into art school, they emailed you directly, asking for money for a new life so they could finally be the parents you deserved. I had their emails blocked to protect you from that poison. Tears were blurring my vision, but I listened. I never said a word, Maya, because I wanted you to have a childhood free from their games. I kept hoping they'd find their way back, become better people. They didn't, and now they will use any tactic to get their hands on your inheritance. They'll use guilt, lies, whatever it takes. The recording clicked off, leaving the room in heavy silence. Mr. Sterling has all the evidence to keep you safe, Isabella's voice had concluded. The guardianship was converted to a full legal adoption on your 16th birthday. I kept my name and didn't change yours, foolishly hoping you might reconnect one day. You are my daughter, Maya. In the eyes of the law, they have no claim on you or anything I have left for you. I just sat there, stunned. My aunt had adopted me. I never knew. Your path forward with them is your own to choose. But protect what's yours. Biology is not a blank check for betrayal and greed. Family is built on presence, not just blood. I am so proud of the woman you've become. Trust your gut. All my love, Isabella. I stared at the dark screen, a storm raging inside me. Mr. Sterling broke the silence. I have the finalized adoption papers right here. It is ironclad. I also have bank records for every transfer and every demand she mentioned. He faced my stunned parents. Furthermore, Miss Alvarez included a failsafe in her will. If it is challenged in court, her entire fortune, including the galleries, will be liquidated and donated to Art for Orphans. There will be nothing left to fight over. Their lawyer, looking pale, leaned in and whispered frantically to my father. We didn't know about any adoption, Julian said, his voice hollow. We thought it was just temporary. Informed by whom? Mr. Sterling asked, his tone cutting. A social worker, Camila chimed in. Everything is documented in our digital archive, Mr. Sterling said, gesturing to his monitor, including the consent forms you both signed in front of a notary. Julian's face twisted in fury. This is fraud! You paid us off! I feel obligated to mention this meeting is being recorded, Mr. Sterling said calmly. And that sounds a lot like admitting you sold your parental rights for cash. My father shot up from his seat. "This isn't over." "We have rights," he shouted. "Dad," I said, the word tasting like ash. I went through Isabella's files. "I know about the others." His eyes flickered. "What others?" "The Chen family in Seattle, the Rodriguez family in Miami. At least 2 more I found. All of them distant cousins of wealthy people who had just passed away. It seems you have a business model. Leave a child with a rich relative, then come back when they die to claim a part of the estate." My mother's tears started again, but they seemed genuine this time. "That's not true. We were just—" "Stop!" I cut in, my patience gone. "Isabella documented everything. She recorded your calls begging for money. Did you really think she'd leave me unprotected?" My father's rage evaporated, replaced by a chilling calm. "Maya, this is a misunderstanding. We can fix this. Just us. No need for lawyers." "We're done," I said, getting to my feet. "Mr. Sterling, is there anything else?" "No," he said. "The estate is legally yours. They have no standing. Then get them out." "Maya, please," my mother begged. "Let us explain." 15 years, I said quietly. "You had 15 years. You waited until my aunt was dead. That's all the explanation I need." Mr. Sterling pressed a button on his desk phone. 2 security guards appeared. "These men shows you out," he said. "All future contact with Ms. Alvarez will be through my office." "You can't do this," Julian roared, his face flushed with anger. "She's our daughter." "No," I said, meeting his gaze. "I was your daughter. Now I'm Isabella's, and she taught me what I'm worth." As security led them out, my mother turned back. "You're not the girl we knew." "You gave birth to me," I replied. "Isabella gave me a life. She saved me from people who see love as a transaction." When the door closed, my legs gave out and I sank into the chair. Mr. Sterling moved a chair beside me, closing the distance between lawyer and client. "You should know," he said softly. "I'm your godfather. Isabella asked me right after the adoption papers were signed. I swore I'd look after you when she couldn't." This new connection to my aunt brought fresh tears. "Why didn't she tell me about the adoption?" "She feared you'd think she was trying to replace your parents, not just protect you from them. She wanted you to define family on your own terms." I confessed she'd been more of a mother than anyone, simply by being there. Mr. Sterling nodded, a look of complete understanding on his face. "We can file for a protective order," he suggested. "With their history and the obvious financial motive, a judge will almost certainly grant it." "Yes," I said immediately. "Let's do that." Leaving the law office, I felt exhausted but also free. My childhood dream of my parents coming back for me had come true. It was a complete disaster, but one Isabella had prepared me for. She saved me again. But that same evening, they showed up at Isabella's San Francisco townhouse, my townhouse. I saw their rented sedan in the driveway while making tea. My first instinct was to run, but a new strength took hold. I had to end this myself. They hammered the doorbell until I yanked the door open, blocking the way with my arm. "You need to leave," I said, my voice steady. "A protective order is being filed in the morning." "We are your parents," Julian screamed, his theatrical composure gone. "You owe us a real conversation." "I don't owe you a thing," I said. "You have 3 minutes to make your point, and then you're leaving, or I'm calling the SFPD." My mother pushed past me, her gaze sweeping over the valuable paintings in the foyer. "We just want to know why you're doing this," she said, her voice a pathetic plea. "We made a mistake. We want to make it right." "By trying to take my inheritance?" I shot back. "That's an interesting way to apologize." My father barged in, his eyes wild. "That woman poisoned you against us," he seethed. "Isabella was always envious of my writing, my potential. She used you as a weapon against me." "Isabella saved me," I yelled. "She gave me stability, a future, a reason to believe in myself. She taught me love is something you do, not a line in a script." "We did love you," Camila insisted. "We were just lost. Your father's career, my nerves, we were drowning." "I was 12, I cried, my voice breaking. I needed parents, not a dramatic backstory. Do you know what it's like to wake up and discover you've been erased? To wait for a phone call that never comes? To tear apart your tiny room looking for a note, any explanation at all?" My father stared at the Persian rug, refusing to look at me. "I checked the mailbox every day for a year," I went on, the pain of a decade pouring out. "I thought you'd at least send a birthday card. Something. Anything to show I still existed." "We thought of you every day," my mother cried. "Thinking isn't the same as being there," I said. Isabella never had to say I love you. She showed up. For every bad grade, every art show, every single time, I was scared. He built a life for us by working day and night. "But we're here for you now," his father said, using that smooth salesman voice I'd heard on old voicemails. "We can move past this. We can be a family. You're here now because Liam died the CEO of a billion-dollar company," I said, my voice cutting through his act. "If he had died with nothing, would you have even come to the funeral?" Their dead silence was the only confession I needed. Mr. Peterson slid a file across the table to me. You've known our address for the last 10 years. You chose to stay away until you read his name in the financial news. That's not fair, his mother whimpered. We were ashamed. We didn't know how to fix things. But you found the courage the day his will was filed. Funny how that worked. My father-in-law's face grew dark again. You have no idea what we went through, barely scraping by while our own son was sitting on a mountain of money that should have been ours. Liam built that company from nothing, I fired back. He worked 20-hour days for years. What did either of you do to deserve one single share of it? I'm his father, he yelled. And you're his mother. So your DNA is a claim check, I asked, my voice dripping with scorn. You don't get to bleed your son dry, ignore him for a decade, and then show up demanding a payout for being related to him. His mother collapsed onto the leather chair, sobbing theatrically. How can you be so cruel? This isn't the woman our son loved. Didn't know the woman your son loved, I told her flatly. You left long before he became the man he was. Headlights swept across the conference room as a car pulled up outside. I had asked Mr. Peterson to arrange for building security to be on standby. That would be for you, I told his parents. It's time for you to leave. This isn't over, his father snarled, grabbing my wrist. You think this is a victory, but we can tell the tabloid stories about Liam that would tarnish his name forever. I ripped my arm away from his grip. And every single word of that threat, I told him, pointing to a tiny camera on the bookshelf, is being recorded. Isabella had those cameras installed years ago, after a gallery stalker. My father's face turned pale as he got it. Every lie he told, every threat he made, was now on a recording. Let's go, he muttered to my mother. She's not worth the hassle. Those words, calling me a hassle instead of his daughter, made everything clear. This was never about reconciliation. It was only about the inheritance. As they walked out, my mother glanced back. You'll regret this. You'll be alone with your cold paintings and your money. Family is everything. I agree, I said. Isabella was my family. You were just the people who threw me away. Once they were gone, I watched a security guard escort them down the long driveway until they disappeared. I slid to the floor, my whole body shaking as the adrenaline wore off. For 15 years, I had pictured this moment, always clinging to the hope of a real apology. Now I had my answer. It hurt, but there was a strange freedom in the clarity. An hour later, my lawyer, Mr. Harrison, called. He told me they'd officially been served with the restraining order. They can't legally come within 1,000 feet of you. He said they swore it wasn't over. Empty threats, he promised me. Isabella's meticulous studio logs would dismantle any tabloid story they could possibly cook up. She'd documented their first attempt to get money years ago. No judge on earth would side with them. After we hung up, I wandered through Isabella's house, seeing it as a home again, not a museum. The sunny studio where she taught me to see light and shadow. Her office, where we'd argue over art history. The little balcony where we had tea every afternoon. I finally went into her private study, a room I couldn't bear to enter since she passed. I opened her favorite old paint box and found a memory card hidden beneath the felt lining. It wasn't a letter, but a video file. I put the card in her tablet and her face filled the screen. My dearest Maya, she began. I was brought up in a time, in a family, where emotion was a sign of weakness, a messy complication. But as I faced this last canvas, I realized that silence is my one true regret. So please let me be perfectly clear about something I should have told you every single day. I love you. Not from some sense of duty, but for the fierce, brilliant, and deeply kind woman you have become. Watching you overcome the scars of your childhood has been the single greatest achievement of my life. I may not have given you life, but you gave my life its meaning. The adoption was finalized years ago, not to protect your inheritance, but to protect my own heart. I needed the world to know, legally and forever, that you were my daughter. Be brave. Be kind. Be happy, Mom. That last word, a title she never let me use when she was alive, cracked something open inside me. I cried that night, not for the parents I'd lost twice, but for the one who was quietly there all along. 6 months have passed since that final ugly confrontation with my biological parents. Harrison told me they moved back to Arizona after a desperate attempt to sell a fake story about Isabella's secret struggles to a gossip site. The editor, an old friend of Isabella's, forwarded the entire pathetic email to Harrison. This house is finally starting to feel like my own again. I've repainted the guest suite, rearranged some of her art, and mixed in my own comfortable furniture, blending my life with her classic style. The grand studio is now my home office, my 2 monitors looking a little funny on the giant work table where she painted her masterpieces. Her artistic estate is thriving. I've implemented a digital archiving strategy that Isabella always fought me on, focusing on high-quality prints and online galleries. Her audience has grown by 30%, and we just signed deals for 2 international museum exhibitions. The team at her gallery, who worshipped Isabella, have now transferred that loyalty to me. They say I have her same unforgiving eye for color. My proudest achievement has been launching the Serafina Project, a foundation for young artists. Using a piece of the estate, I've started a nonprofit that funds mentorships for teens out of the foster system, helping them tell their stories through art. Through the foundation, I've met so many others with stories similar to mine. Some have found a way to forgive their pasts, while others have built new families out of friendship. Every story is different, but the need for a love you can trust is universal. My own therapy has changed. We spend less time on the abandonment itself and more on the strange grief of their return. My therapist helped me understand that closure doesn't always mean forgiveness. The fantasy of a perfect reunion is powerful, she said, but accepting a painful reality is its own form of peace. You know, real growth starts when you stop trying to fix what was broken and start building something new. 3 months ago, a letter arrived from my biological mother. For once, there was no demand for money. It was just an apology, and for the first time, it actually sounded real. I haven't written back. Maybe I never will. It's just sitting in a drawer, a question I'm not ready to deal with. What's strange is I'm finding real family in places I never thought to look. Like Sophia, Isabella's housekeeper. She still comes by a couple of times a week. She tells me things about Livia before I was in her life, filling in the portrait of the woman who raised me. Just last week, Mrs. Grayson told me Livia was absolutely panicked when I first came to her. She never intended to have children and was worried she'd be terrible at it. My first night there, she stayed up until 3 a.m., frantically looking up child psychology books online. Hearing about her secret worries and how hard she fought for me, it gets me every time. She accepted a role she never wanted and gave it her entire soul. My godfather, Lawson, is a constant too, coming over for dinner once a month to talk about work and life. He's my godfather, but he feels more like an uncle, way warmer than I ever would have guessed. Livia would be so proud of you, he said recently while we were looking over the Foundation's finances. He said she respected my business instincts, but she really admired my resilience. Livia was always afraid my past would make me bitter, that I'd never trust anyone. Instead, here I am, using it all to help others. After hitting pause on my love life during Livia's sickness and the legal nightmare, I'm finally dating again. It's early, but I'm handling it differently now with much clearer boundaries. Livia showed me that real love is in what you do, day in and day out, not just in the things you say. But the most profound change has been inside me. That question that ate me alive for 15 years, why did they give me away? It doesn't have the same sting anymore. I understand now. Their choice to leave was about their own damage, not my worth. What actually mattered was Isabella's choice to stay, to fight for me, to be there without fail. I visited her grave last weekend with a bouquet of her favorite lilies. It's a simple black granite stone, just the way she would have wanted. After the full adoption story came out, I added one small thing. Right under her name, it now simply says Mother. Standing there, it finally clicked. Family has absolutely nothing to do with blood or birth certificates. It's about a million tiny choices you make every single day. Who shows up for you? Who sticks by you when life gets messy? Who brings you safety instead of chaos? Isabella taught me that true wealth was never about money. Real richness is in your character, in keeping your promises, and in earning the trust of others. That's the inheritance she left me. It wasn't paintings and property. She gave me a guide for how to live with purpose. She proved that the family you choose can be the strongest family of all. I don't know if I'll ever find out if my birth parents are actually sorry, or if they just regret losing out on a payday. But frankly, their reasons don't hold the power over me they once did. What matters is the life I am building, the people I choose to keep in it, and the legacy I want to create. Has anything ever happened that made you redefine your idea of family? Do you think blood relatives deserve an automatic second chance, or is trust something that must be earned? I would be honored to read about your own experiences down in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real stories. If you have a friend who's going through some tough family issues, maybe share this video. It might be something they really need to hear right now. Thanks for listening to my story. And never forget, the family you build is often the family that makes you whole.